She had spent 2 years building something no one else had thought to count.
Every Thursday, she had waited for Ashvale's wagon. This one was different.
She recognized the wagon. It did not belong to Theron.
The visible characters remain completely silent, with no speech or vocalizations from the woman in the distance or the man driving the wagon.
He came to her farm looking for animals. He did not yet understand what he was looking at.
The wagon left before the ground had fully thawed. Etha Voss stood inside the barn and listened to the wheels creak down the frozen lane until the sound dissolved into the grayish Wisconsin morning. She did not go to the door to watch. There was nothing left to see that she had not already counted twice. The empty stalls, the bare hooks along the south wall where halters had hung in a row since 1871, the feed trough scared clean by the men who came to take the last of it. What remained was the structure itself, the timber and stone her husband Harlan had raised in the second year of their marriage, when his hands were still strong and the county still felt like it might reward him work without stopping. Harlan had worked without stopping. That had not been enough. She held a ledger against her coat. It was thick, the spine cracked in 2 places, the cover stained from a calving that went badly in the winter of 1887. She had not sold it because no one had asked for it. Books of numbers drawn in a woman's hand did not fetch prices at an estate clearing. She had kept it because she had written every figure in it herself, and she intended to write more. The barn smelled of absence, hay dust, and old wood, the particular cold that settles into a building when the animals that warmed it are gone. Etha walked the length of it, running one hand along the stall partitions. 60 pen spaces, 40 of them had held milking cows at the height of what she and Harlan had built together. The other 20 had been for young stock, the heifers coming up through their second and third years. She had managed the calving records, the feed adjustments, the breeding cycles, the milk quality checks. And Harlan had moved the animals and driven the wagons and fixed the machinery when it broke, which was often. Between the two of them, the work had been continuous and specific, and Etha had understood every part of it. She was 43 years old. She had grown up on a dairy farm outside Lancaster, Pennsylvania, crossed into Wisconsin with Harlan when she was 24, and spent the following 19 years learning everything the land and the animals were willing to teach. She knew how long a freshened cow took to return to peak production. She knew which bloodlines threw calves that gained weight reliably in cold weather. She knew the difference between a respiratory problem that would resolve in 4 days and one that would move through an entire young group if the animal was not separated before nightfall. These were not things she had been taught in a formal sense. They were things she had learned by keeping records and reading them back against outcomes until the patterns stopped surprising her. Harlan's lungs had failed him in the winter of 1881. The illness came on quickly and worsened faster than either of them had prepared for, and by the time it was clear that he would not recover, the cost of the treatments and the weeks lost from the work had already begun to pull at the accounts. She sold the milking herd first, then the replacement heifers, then the equipment that could be moved, the land and the buildings she held. The mortgage at First Bank of Caldwell's Ford she could not touch, $312 due before the spring of 1884, a figure that sat in the back of her mind, but with the particular weight of something she was not permitted to forget. The neighbors had come in the weeks after the funeral, bringing food and quiet condolences, and in several cases, careful suggestions that the farm might be more than a widow could manage alone. The minister had said something similar in gentler language. Etha had thanked each of them and meant it. She did not need their pity, and she did not want their management of her expectations. What she needed was a system, and systems were things she knew how to build. She spread the county map on the kitchen table that same week. Renner County stretched across 30 miles of rolling Wisconsin farmland, and in the decades since the big creameries had taken hold, the dairy operations had grown large enough to change the texture of the roads. You could tell which routes the milk wagons used by the wear on the packed earth and the particular smell that hung in the morning air near the collection points. Etha had driven those roads for years. She knew where the milk went, and more usefully, she had begun to understand where some of it did not go. Ashvale Creamery sat 4 miles northeast of Caldwell's Ford on a rise above a creek that had no name on the county map. It ran 1,800 cows across 3 milking shifts, and the wagons moved in and out of it at hours that suggested the operation never fully stopped. Etha had passed it regularly for years without particular attention, but in the month after Harlan's funeral, she had started watching more carefully. She noticed the wagons that did not go toward the processing facility in town. They went east instead, down a farm lane toward a low field, and they came back empty. She asked the driver of one of them at the feed merchant's lot in Caldwell's Ford. He He was a broad-shouldered man named Theron who had been hauling for Ashvale for 6 years and had no reason to be secretive about the loads. The milk was rejected, he told her. Cows under antibiotic treatment, fresh cows in their first days of production whose milk the plant could not accept, loads that failed the testing at collection. None of it could enter the food supply. Ashvale hired it disposed of, paid by the gallon, and documented every load for the county records. The cost was real, and it recurred every week without exception. Etha thanked him and drove home. She sat at the kitchen table that evening with the map, the ledger, and a sheet of paper she used for calculations. If she could accept the rejected loads under a formal agreement, Ashvale would eliminate a disposal cost. She would receive the milk at no charge and assume responsibility for it once it reached her farm. From there, the milk could feed calves, if she had calves. Ashvale was a large operation. Large operations produced lower-ranked heifers that did not meet their own replacement standards. Healthy animals, worth something, but not worth the 2 years of expense required to bring them into the milking string at a facility with Ashvale's production targets. Those animals were sold cheaply, often to whoever asked. She wrote the numbers twice, slowly. Feed cost near zero. Calf acquisition cost well below market. Infrastructure she already owned if it could be returned to working order. The risk was the pasteurizer. Harlan's old batch unit had sat idle for 2 years, and she did not know yet what the seals and heating elements looked like inside. The risk was also the labor, which would be entirely hers. She looked at both figures for a long time. Then she folded the paper once, set it under the ledger, and went to bed. She drove to Ashvale the following morning without an appointment. The office was a frame building attached to the north end of the main barn, and it smelled of cattle and ink and the particular mixture of sawdust and grease that accumulates in places where machinery is always running. Court Hagen came to the front when the woman at the desk called back for him, and he arrived with the expression of a man who had already decided the conversation would be short. He was 42, with a broad forehead and a way of standing that communicated efficiency before he spoke. He managed the full operation at Ashvale, scheduling, personnel, equipment, the disposal contracts, all of it, and he carried the particular impatience of someone whose mornings were always already spoken for. Etha set her proposal on the counter, 2 pages written in the same hand that had kept her calving records for 19 years. She had organized it with the disposal cost on the first line and her terms below it laid out clearly without flourish. Hagen picked it up. He read it once quickly, then again slowly. When he looked up, his assessment was direct.
You're running 80 acres by yourself.
Etha reached into her coat and placed a record book beside the proposal. 19 years of milk production data, the calving records, weight gains, feed conversion ratios, and veterinary notes. The handwriting was steady throughout, even in the entries from the hard winters. Read what you need to, she said. Then decide. He spent 4 minutes with it. He turned pages without speaking, pausing twice at sections she could not see from across the counter. When he set it down, his expression had not warmed, but something in it had shifted in the way that practical men shift when numbers confirm something they had not expected. He asked 3 more questions. She answered each one without elaboration. The disposal contract he was currently running cost Ashvale money every week. Her proposal eliminated it and transferred the responsibility cleanly once the milk reached her property. The legal terms were straightforward. The arrangement required cows to change to Ashvale's existing hauling schedule because her farm lane fell within 2 miles of the route the wagons already used. Hagen signed at the bottom of the second page. He was capping his pen when he mentioned, without looking up, that Ashvale was looking at a possible expansion. Nothing confirmed yet, he said, just something the owners were considering. He said it the way men say things they do not realize they are saying, as conversational filler between the signing and the standing up. Etha registered it without reaction. She filed it in the same part of her mind where she kept the figures she intended to work with later. Before she turned to leave, she asked about the heifers. Hagen paused. It was a brief pause, the kind that happens when a question lands slightly outside the expected boundary of a conversation. He confirmed that Ashvale did sell lower-ranked heifers from time to time, animals that were healthy and sound, but below the genetic and production threshold the creamery required for its replacement string. They were sold at reduced prices when buyers came asking. He had not considered that she would be asking. She told him she would like to see the records on the current group. He went to a drawer and came back with 3 folded sheets. Breeding lines, birth dates, weights at last measurement. She read through them at the counter without sitting down. She took her time. When she was finished, she named 14 animals by their record numbers and said she wanted those 14 with their Ashvale ear tags left in place. Hagen wrote it down. The ear tag condition struck him as unusual. Buyers typically removed a previous owner's tags and applied their own. But the price was fair and the paperwork was simple. He did not ask for her reasoning. He had a full morning behind him and a longer afternoon ahead. 2 weeks later, on a morning cold enough to film the water in the barn gutters with thin ice, an Ashvale wagon back to the Voss barn door. The 14 calves came down the ramp one by one, their breath visible in the raw air, each one wearing a brass-numbered ear tag that bore the Ashvale mark. Etha stood at the foot of the ramp and looked at each animal as it passed, her eyes moving from the feet upward, checking the joints for no swelling, the coat for roughness, the eyes for clarity. She did not rush the process. Every calf she had selected from the records showed well in person, which told her the records had been kept honestly. She put them in the south pens, which she had spent the previous week repairing. New boards where the old ones had splintered, fresh bedding packed deep against the cold, the feeding trough rebuilt along the east wall at a height appropriate for young stock. The water pails were hung low. The pen divisions allowed her to separate animals by size if she needed to, which she anticipated she would. The pasteurizer occupied the northeast corner of the equipment shed. It was a batch unit, cast iron and copper, built for exactly this kind of farm operation and capable of handling the volumes she expected from Ashvale's rejected loads. Harlan had used it during an earlier period when they had run a small calf-raising enterprise before expanding the milking herd, and it had worked reliably then. 2 years of sitting idle had done what cold and inactivity do to machinery. She replaced the seals, cleaned the heating coils with a brush and then with water pushed through at pressure, and tested every gauge against a second instrument before she trusted any reading. She ran the unit empty twice at temperature before she considered it ready. The first rejected load arrived on a Thursday morning. Wagon pulled alongside the holding tank in the yard, the driver opened the valve, and the milk came down in a thick white stream. Etha was there before the valve opened. She had a jar, a thermometer, and a small kit for checking antibiotic residue. A method she had used before on loads she was uncertain about. She sampled the milk at the tank, checked the temperature, held it to the light. It was acceptable. She noted the wagon number, the time, and the load condition in a new section of her ledger before she opened the line to the pasteurizer. That evening, she sat at the kitchen table with the ledger open. She had added a column for each calf, the Ashvale tag number on the left, followed by the date of arrival, the estimated weight at arrival, and the health condition as she had assessed it. To the right of those columns, she had left space for the weekly weights, the feeding amounts, the vaccination dates, and whatever notes the veterinarian would eventually add. The page looked spare at the moment, 14 rows of beginning entries. She looked at it for a while before she closed the book. Ashvale's wagon had carried a disposal problem. What sat in her south pens tonight was something else. The farm had been silent since Harlan died. Not the silence of rest, but the silence of a working place that has stopped working, which is a different kind of quiet entirely, heavier, with a quality of an incompleteness, a sentence broken off before its final word. The calves changed the sound of the barn, not dramatically. They were 14 animals in 60 pen spaces, and their noise was modest against the size of the building. But it was consistent and purposeful, which was more than she had been able to say about the place in more than a year. Doc Ferris-Oaks came out 3 weeks after the calves arrived. He was the county's traveling veterinarian, a careful man in his mid-50s who had spent 30 years learning the particular ways livestock in this part of Wisconsin intended to fail, and he had developed a professional respect for farmers who kept written records and a professional wariness of those who did not. He looked at each calf, checked the coat condition and the eyes and the gut sounds, ran his hands along the hindquarters of two that seemed slightly lighter than the others. Then he asked to see what she was writing down. She showed him the ledger. He spent longer with it than Court Hagen had spent with the proposal. These feeding amounts are specific, he said. It was less a compliment than an observation, the kind a careful person makes when they are still deciding what they are looking at. I adjust by the animal, Etha said. Smaller ones were getting the same ration as the larger ones when they came in. I changed that the first week. He handed the book back. He would be out again in 3 weeks. He said it the way he said most things, directly and without elaboration, and she understood it to mean he considered the operation worth monitoring. The weeks built on each other in the way that farm weeks do. The work is consistent, and the animals are healthy. Not dramatically, but steadily, with the slow accumulation of small decisions that eventually add up to something that cannot be easily explained to someone who was not present for every one of them. Etha weighed the calves every Thursday, the same day the Ashvale wagon came. She compared the week's gain against the previous weeks, noted any animal that fell below expectations, and adjusted accordingly. She kept the sick pen ready at all times, though she did not need it in those first weeks. She also wrote letters to Ashvale once a month, requesting the breeding records for the next group of heifers she wanted to evaluate. Hagen's office sent the papers without comment. She could imagine the person who filed the request thinking of her as a peculiarly thorough woman, and she did not mind that characterization. She read each set of records at the kitchen table under the lamp, making notes in the margins with a pencil she kept behind the ledger's back cover. April came with mud, and then with the first real warmth of the year. The calves had been on the farm for 2 months. The two that had been lighter at arrival had closed most of the gap with the others. The coats had improved across the group, which she attributed partly to the feeding program and partly to the quality of the rejected milk itself. Transition milk from recently fresh-young cows, which she had learned was nutritionally richer than standard produced milk that most calf raisers used if they used milk at all. She opened her expense ledger on an evening in late April and added the current figures. Feed supplements purchased to balance the milk ration. Veterinary visits. The seals and materials for the pasteurizer as a repair. The 14 calves themselves. She tallied the outgoing total and then wrote the current balance in the bank below it. What remained after the spring costs would carry her for approximately 11 more weeks before the account ran to a point she could not sustain. She looked at that number for a while. Then she closed the ledger, set it on the shelf above the stove, and went out to the barn for the evening check. June arrived with heat that came earlier than usual and settled across Renner County like something that intended to stay. The calves were thriving, their individual weights now consistently above the target she had set at the beginning, their coats smooth and bright, their consumption steady and predictable. Etha had begun thinking of them not as a group, but as 14 separate animals with 14 different patterns, and her notes reflected that. She knew which ones came to the trough eagerly, and which ones held back until the others had settled. She knew which one knocked its pail with its right leg so reliably that she had begun hanging that pail an inch higher to account for it. On a Thursday in late June, the Ashvale wagon arrived with a load that looked right. The temperature at the holding tank read correctly on her thermometer. The residue check came back clean. She ran the batch through the pasteurizer on the standard protocol, watched the gauge climb to temperature, held it there for the required time, and opened the cooling line. The milk moved to the calf pens that afternoon. She recorded the wagon number, the batch details, and the distribution amounts in the ledger. 3 days later, the pen closest to the door went quiet. It was a Tuesday morning. She noticed it during the early feeding. 3 animals standing without interest at the trough, their heads lower than usual, their eyes showing the particular dullness that preceded a loss of appetite in earnest. By noon, they were not eating. By late afternoon, one of them had scours, loose and pale, a combination that told her what she needed to know before she had confirmed anything. She did not assume. That was the first discipline she imposed on herself, the same discipline she had applied to every difficult situation on this farm since she had begun keeping records. Assume nothing. Look at what is written down. Trace the thing from its beginning. She pulled 4 documents from the ledger and laid them side by side on the workbench in the equipment shed. The wagon log from Thursday, the batch record from the pasteurizer, the feeding sheet for that group, the weight record for the affected animals from the previous 2 weeks. She sat with them for an hour, reading each one against the others. Doc Oakes arrived the following morning with his kit. He examined the 3 sick animals, drew samples from 2 of them, and did not offer an opinion before he had something to base it on. The samples went to a testing chemist the county employed in Madison. The results came back in 4 days. The contamination present in the samples should not have survived a properly executed pasteurization cycle. That was the finding. The milk had not been the problem. The process had been. She went back to the pasteurizer that afternoon with the batch record and the thermometer she used to verify the gauge readings. She ran a test batch of water at the protocol temperature and held a second thermometer in the tank while the gauge displayed its reading. The difference was 11 degrees. The gauge was reading high. The actual temperature during the June batch had been below the threshold required to eliminate the contamination, and the gauge had told her otherwise, and she had believed the gauge. She replaced the gauge that day. She ordered a second one from the supply house in Madison and installed both, so that any future reading could be cross-checked without removing the cover. She rewrote the batch protocol in the front of the equipment log, no batch to be cleared on a single instrument reading, no exceptions. She ran the unit empty through a full cycle with both gauges reading before she accepted the calibration. 2 of the 3 sick animals recovered fully within the week. The third, the lightest one, the one that had taken longest to close its weight gap, did not. She found it on a Saturday morning, still in its pen, down and unresponsive. She sat with it for an hour before she called Doc Oakes. He came out, confirmed what she already understood, and helped her move the animal. She wrote the entry in the ledger that evening, tag number, date, confirmed by veterinary examination. She left nothing blank. The remaining 13 came through the summer without further incident. By August, their gains had not only recovered from the destruction, but exceeded the targets she had set in the spring. The improvement, partly a result of the corrected pasteurization, and partly a result of feed adjustments she had made in July when she noticed that 2 of the younger animals were converting less efficiently than their early performance had predicted. Doc Oakes came out for his regular visit at the end of August. He worked through the group methodically, as he always did. When he finished, he stood at the gate of the south pen and looked at the animals for a moment before he spoke. The first group came in underweight and uncertain. These 13 are ahead of where I would expect them. Etha closed the gate latch. The protocol change helped. It's not just the protocol. He was still looking at the animals. You're adjusting to each one individually. That takes time nobody charges for. She did not answer that. The time was hers to spend as she chose, and she had chosen to spend it carefully. The fall brought its own rhythm. She requested a second group of breeding records from Ashvale in September and received them within a week. She read through the paperwork at the kitchen table over 2 evenings, made her selects, and sent her request back by post. In October, another Ashvale wagon arrived with 8 more heifers. These were older than the first group, better developed, requiring different management, and she adjusted her pen configuration accordingly, moving the first group to the north side to keep the age divisions clean. Court Hagen's office had now sent her 3 sets of animal records and 2 load reports in response to her requests, and she had noticed something in the pattern. They sent what she asked for, promptly and without question. It was possible they thought she was being overcautious. It was possible they had not thought about it at all. Either way, the records arrived, and she read them, and she made decisions based on what they told her. The county office in Caldwell's Ford was a 2-room frame building on the main road through town, and Etha passed it every few weeks on her supply runs. In early November, she stopped to check the bulletin board inside the front room, where the county clerk posted notices of permits, hearings, and land filings. She read the notices on the board without particular expectation. One of them carried the Ashvale Creamery name. She stood in front of it and read it twice. Ashvale had filed a formal application for a building permit, a new dairy barn, expanded facilities, a projected herd increase from 1,800 cows to 2,800. The application listed the proposed construction timeline. The anticipated completion date was in the fall of 1885. She took a copy of the filing number from the clerk's desk and put it in her coat pocket. That evening, she sat at the kitchen table with the ledger, the expense record, the breeding notes for both groups of Ashvale heifers, and the calendar she kept tacked to the wall beside the stove. She worked backward from the permit's completion date and forward from the birth dates of her youngest animals. A barn expansion of that scale required animals to fill it. Replacement heifers, bred, healthy, and ready to enter the milking string, required close to 2 years from birth to first lactation. Ashvale's current replacement calendar, based on the records they had been sending her, put their next ready group well after the projected construction completion. She set the calendar down and looked at both sets of numbers. A barn could be built in months. A springing heifer could not be rushed. She did not sleep well that night, not from worry, but from the particular alertness that comes when a large calculation completes itself, and the answer is not what anyone else appears to have noticed yet. She lay awake and ran the figures again in the dark, testing them for the error she might have made. She found none. In the morning, she went to the barn for the early feeding and stood at the gate of the north pen, watching the older group work through their rations. 22 animals now, between the 2 groups. The Ashvale tag numbers caught the thin light coming through the high windows, small brass rectangles, each one stamped with the creamery's mark, each one recorded in the ledger above the kitchen stove. She had not been managing an experiment. She had not been proving a theory. She had been building one correct decision at a time, in a barn that most people in Renner County assumed would stay empty. The thing she had been building now had a shape she could see clearly, and the shape matched a gap she had identified in someone else's timeline. The mortgage at First Bank of Caldwell's Ford was due before the spring of 1884. She had 8 months left on that clock. The animals she was raising would not be ready to sell before the spring of 1885. That gap remained, and she was not going to pretend it away. She would need to find a way to carry the operation through the winter and into the following year without the resources that most farms would have used. What she had instead was the same thing she had started with: a system, a ledger, and the discipline to keep working the numbers until they resolved. She pulled the feeding pail off its hook, walked to the north pen trough, and poured the morning ration. The cold deepened through January of 1883 without ceremony. Etha kept the barn at a temperature the calves could tolerate by banking the outer walls with straw bales and watching the animals for the particular stillness that meant they were drawing heat from each other rather than from the air. She had done this before, in winters when the herd was full and the work was shared. Doing it alone required a different kind of attention, slower, more deliberate, the kind that comes when there is no one to catch what you miss. The morning feeding ran on a schedule she had printed in block letters and tacked to the post nearest the south pen gate, not because she needed to read it, because a schedule written down and posted was harder to abbreviate than one carried only in the head. She had learned that from a hard February in 1878, when a sick cow in 3 days of difficult weather had pulled her attention away from the young stock long enough to cost her 2 animals she should not have lost. She did not make that mistake twice. By the first week of February, the 14 animals in the south pen had been on the farm for just over 3 months. The 2 that had arrived lightest were no longer visibly behind the others. Their weekly gains had stabilized at figures she considered acceptable, though not yet figures she considered satisfying. She adjusted their ration again, a small increase in the grain component, offset by a reduction in the poorest quality hay she had been stretching since November. The calculations was tight. Every pound of feed she purchased was a line in the expense ledger, and she reviewed those lines every Sunday evening by the lamp at the kitchen table. The rejected milk kept coming on Thursdays. Each load went through the rebuilt pasteurizer without incident through the spring, both gauges reading within 1 degree of each other on every batch, the cross-check protocol holding cleanly. She had developed a feel for the timing now. The way the tank temperature climbed in the first 20 minutes, the slight hesitation in the rise that sometimes indicated a coil not drawing heat evenly, the steady hold that meant everything was working as it should. She monitored it in person for every batch, not because the equipment required her presence, but because the equipment had already told her once that it could produce a convincing reading while something behind the gauge was failing. The testing for antibiotic residue she performed at the holding tank before the milk entered the pasteurizer at all. Anything that failed to screen stayed in the tank and went back on the wagon. She had needed to reject 2 loads since January, one in March that showed residue levels she did not trust, one in April where the temperature at arrival indicated the milk had been held too long before transport. She noted both rejections in the ledger with the wagon number and the reason. Court Hagen's office received copies of the rejection notes by post. No one from Ashvale commented on them. Doc Oakes came out in March and again in May. In March, he had adjusted a vaccination protocol for the younger group and left her with a written note on what to watch for in the weeks following. In May, he spent longer with the South Pen animals, working through them one by one with a methodical patience she had to appreciate precisely because it never hurried. When he finished, he stood at the pen gate and looked back at the group as a whole. Their growth rates are better than what I'm seeing from larger operations this spring. Not with surprise, but with the particular flatness of a man who preferred accuracy to enthusiasm. Etha was writing the vaccination dates into the ledger. The adjusted rations helped. The adjusted rations helped, he agreed. The record-keeping keeps the adjustments honest. She looked up at that. It was the most direct thing he had said to her in 3 months of visits, and she weighed it as she would have weighed any observation from a careful source, for what it confirmed, not for the comfort it offered. By September, the combined groups, 13 from the original purchase, 8 from the October delivery, numbered 21 animals in 2 pens. The North Pen held the older group. The South Pen held the younger. She moved between them on a schedule, as fixed as the feeding routine, noting differences between the 2 cohorts and accounting for them in the management. The older animals were beginning to show the structure of what they would become. Broader through the hip, longer in the back, carrying more condition than she would have predicted from the thin records that had accompanied them out Ashvale's loading pen. She requested the 3rd set of breeding records from Ashvale in September. The paperwork arrived by the following Wednesday, faster than the previous 2 sets. She read them at the kitchen table over 2 evenings, pencil in hand. The genetic lines she had been selecting for shared several traits. Consistent early maturity, good milk production from dams with clean health records. Structural soundness in the hind legs, as she had learned, over 19 years predicted longevity in the milking string. She was not selecting for the highest production lines. She was selecting for reliability, because a reliable heifer entering a new milking operation in her first lactation was worth more in practical terms than an impressive animal that required additional management. She sent her selection request back to Ashvale by Friday's post. The following week brought a development she had not calculated for. A rider came down her lane on a Tuesday afternoon in late September, one of Ashvale's junior men, a young fellow named Garrett, who drove the second supply wagon and occasionally helped with the records at the office. His manner when he delivered the message had the stiff formality of someone who had been told what to say and was concentrating on saying it exactly. Court Hagen was suspending the sale of replacement-grade heifers to outside buyers, effective the end of the month. A buyer from a farm operation in the eastern part of the county approached Ashvale directly with an offer to purchase the full available group. Animals Etha had not yet selected from. Animals she needed for the second phase of what she had been building. The price the eastern buyer had offered was higher than the per-head rate Etha had been paying. The suspension would remain in place until Ashvale had completed that sale. She set down the coil brush she had been holding. Garrett delivered the second part of the message, which was that Hagen regretted the inconvenience and expected the arrangement with the rejected milk loads to continue as before. Etha thanked him. She asked him to water his horse at the trough before he left. Then she walked back to the equipment shed and stood looking at the pasteurizer for a long moment. She needed 18 more animals from Ashvale's current group. She had been planning on them since August, had already allocated pen space, already adjusted her feed projections, already built their purchase cost in the timeline she had been running in her head since she stood in the county office and read the expansion permit. Without those 18 animals, the second phase of the program collapsed. She would have 21 heifers ready in the spring of 1885. 21 animals would not fill a barn built for 1,000 new cows. She understood Ashvale's situation. A higher offer from a competing buyer was a straightforward business decision. It was also a decision that would end what she had been doing before it could complete itself. She washed her hands at the yard pump, changed her coat, and harnessed the mare. She was at the Ashvale office before 4 o'clock. Hagen was at his desk when the woman in the front room brought him back the news that Etha Voss had arrived without an appointment and was waiting. He came out with the expression of a man who had expected the visit and had already prepared for it, which meant he had prepared for the version of it he anticipated, rather than the version she intended to deliver. She did not ask him to reverse the suspension. She put a folded paper on the counter between them, opened it, and turned it so he could read it. On the side, she had written the Eastern buyer's probable offer range, calculated from current market prices and the standard per head premium a volume buyer typically paid. On the right side, she had written the monthly value of the disposal contract she had been servicing since January, the cost Ashvale had been paying before the arrangement, minus the zero they paid now, multiplied by the months remaining in their current agreement. If she withdrew from the rejected milk arrangement, Ashvale's disposal costs would return immediately. The Eastern buyer's premium on the Heifers sale would not offset that cost within the first year. Hagen looked at the paper. His jaw moved slightly, the way a man's jaw moves when he is doing arithmetic. He does not want to show on his face. You calculated our disposal rate from the county records. It was not quite a question. The filing is public. Her voice held nothing defensive. You filed the original contract for the record. I read it. He was quiet for a moment. The barn sounds came through the wall, the low movement of cattle, the distant machinery of an operation that never fully stopped. You put this together before you drove out here. I put it together before Garrett rode down my lane. Something in his expression changed. Not warmth, more like a recalibration, the adjustment a practical man makes when he realizes the person across from him has been thinking further ahead than he gave her credit for. He asked how many animals she needed. She told him 18. He sold her. 18, the Eastern buyer received the remainder of the group. Etha drove home in the early dark with the agreement written on the second page she had brought blank for that purpose, signed at the bottom in Hagen's hand. The 18 animals arrived in October, younger than the second group, and requiring a third pen configuration. She built the division herself over 2 days using boards she had stored in the equipment shed since the previous winter. The new pen sat between the north and south pens, organized so the youngest animals were separated from both older groups, but accessible from the same central aisle. She adjusted the feeding schedule to account for 3 distinct age cohorts operating simultaneously, wrote the new version on a fresh sheet, and tacked it over the old one on the post by the gate. Doc Oakes came out in November and spent most of the visit in the new pen. He was less interested in the older groups at this point. They were progressing as he expected, and more interested in what the youngest animals told him about the selection decisions Etha had made from the records. He picked out 2 of the heifers by their breeding lines alone, ran his hands over their structure, and stood back with the expression he used when something matched a prediction he had held privately for a while. These 2 will be your best producers in 3 years. I know. She was writing in the ledger. I selected them from their dams records. He watched her write for a moment. Most farmers don't get records like that from the operation they bought from. Most farmers don't ask for them. He left that alone. He finished the pen check, wrote his notes in the margin of her ledger as she held it open for him, and told her he would be back in January. The winter of 1883 into 1884 was harder than the previous one. A cold front came down from the north in December and stayed through February, and the temperatures on the worst nights required her to check the barn at 2 in the morning, as well as at the standard evening and early morning times. She rigged a second lamp on the south wall of the equipment shed so that she could see clearly during the night checks, without waking the animals more than the light and her presence already did. She worked through it without incident, which she attributed to the straw banking, the pen configuration that kept the youngest animals from the drafts near the east door, and the feeding adjustments she made when the cold deepened. The expense account at First Bank of Caldwell's Ford had been carrying her through on a margin that left no room for unexpected costs. She had managed to avoid most of them. The pasteurizer required 1 additional part in January, a coupling in the inlet line that had been weakening since the fall, and finally gave way during a morning batch. She had a spare fitting from a different piece of machinery that proved compatible after 20 minutes of adaptation work. That repair cost her nothing but time, which was the one resource she had in sufficient supply. February brought Doc Oakes for his delayed visit, the bad roads having kept him a week past his usual schedule. He worked through all 3 groups in a single morning, moving with the efficiency of a man who had been to this farm enough times to know its organization without being shown. When he finished, he stood at the gate of the North Pen, the original group, the animals that had been on the farm for nearly a year and a half, and looked at them with a directness that she recognized as something other than a routine evaluation. "These are bred animals," he said it quietly. "November." Etha latched the gate. "The first group. I had the bull brought out in November." He turned to look at her. The November breeding date put the first calving expectation in late August or early September of 1884, which would mean the first group of heifers would be entering their first lactation in the fall. Well-developed, proven in pregnancy, with complete health records going back to their first week on this farm. "You've been planning the calving dates, not an accusation. Something closer to recognition." "I've been planning everything." She said without emphasis, as a statement of fact about how she worked rather than a declaration of anything larger. He picked up his kit. He looked at the animals one more time before he moved toward the barn door. "The people at Ashvale know what they sold you?" She considered the questions with care. "They know what they sold. They don't know what it became." He walked out without adding to that. She went back to the ledger. March arrived with the first softening of the ground and the particular smell of Wisconsin farmland, releasing the cold it had been holding since December. She worked through the mud season with a set of improvised board walkways she had laid between the barn, the equipment shed, and the holding tank. She replaced 2 boards that had split under the frost and kept the rest. She had been monitoring the First Bank of Caldwell's Ford mortgage figure against her remaining capital since the previous fall. The payment due before the spring of 1884 was the one Harlan had borrowed against the land to build the North Barn extension in 1878. $312, plus the accumulated interest on the months she had been carrying it past its original term. She had renegotiated the term once already, in the weeks after Harlan's funeral, trading a higher interest rate for 6 additional months. The banker who had handled the paperwork had been courteous and careful with his words in the way of a man maintaining professional distance from an outcome he considers likely. She went into town in early March with the figures she had been assembling since January. Not the full amount. She did not have the full amount. What she had was a partial payment and a specific accounting of the income she projected from the heifer sales she expected to complete in the spring of 1885. The banker, a man named Gunderson, who had taken over the account the previous year, listened to her presentation without interrupting. He asked 2 questions, both of which she had anticipated, and for which she brought written documentation. He gave her a 6-month extension at the same elevated rate she was already carrying, which added to the total but preserved the operation for another season. She drove home from that meeting on a March afternoon with the early lights still in the sky and a weight on her shoulders that she did not try to name. She had to give herself time. Time was not same as safety. She understood the difference clearly. The county office in Caldwell's Ford posted a second notice in April of 1884. She saw it on a Wednesday when she came in for supplies. The notice was pinned below the original permit application she had read in November. This one was the approval. County had granted Ashvale Creamery the building permit for the expansion project. Construction was to begin in the spring of 1884, with a projected completion target in the fall of 1885. She stood in front of it for a long moment. Then she took out the small notebook she kept in her coat pocket and wrote down the completion date. That evening, she spread every document she had on the kitchen table, the breeding records for all 3 groups, the calving date projections she had made in the fall, the expected development timeline from breeding to first lactation, the expense ledger, the bank extension paperwork, a rough count of her current animals grouped by age. The numbers arranged themselves into a shape she had been watching for him since November. The first group, now bred to calve in late summer 1884, would be springing heifers by the spring of 1885. They would have completed their first calving and be moving into early lactation by the time Ashvale's new barn reached its completion date. The second and third groups would be ready on a rolling schedule behind them. Ashvale was building a barn it could not fill with its own animals. Their replacement calendar was behind the construction schedule by a margin they had created themselves. Selling off the lower-ranked heifers year after year to reduce short-term costs, the same animals they were now not raising, the same calendar they were now behind on. She had 60 animals on this farm. All of them carried Ashvale's ear tags. She sat with the table fable up till the lamp needed trimming. Then trimmed it and sat some more. Fakilby's calculation was complete. What remained was the most difficult part of any plan built on a long timeline, the waiting, which cost money every week it continued and offered nothing certain in return. In the morning, she went to Court Hagen. She drove to Ashvale without a formal appointment. He was in the equipment yard when she arrived, standing with two of his workers near a harness fitting that was giving them trouble. He saw her wagon turn in and came to meet her at the office door, with the look of a man whose morning had already been complicated. She told him she wanted to take in another group of heifers, 20 animals. He looked at her with an expression that moved through several phases too quickly to catalog. He knew the pens on her farm. He had seen them during the one visit he had made in January of 1883, when he came to verify that the disposal arrangement was operating as specified. The pens at that point had been configured for the first group. That was more than a year ago. "Your barn is full," he said. "I reconfigured the pens in October." She said it without inflection. "I have capacity for 20 more." He was quiet. The equipment yard noise filled the space between them. Metal on metal, a horse shifting its weight, the distant low sound of the milking barn. He was trying to work out what she was doing with limited information she had given him, which was not enough.
"You're going to be sitting on a lot of heifers," he said at last. "I've been sitting on heifers since January of last year."
She let that stand for a moment. "They're not sitting still." He did not have a ready answer to that. He went inside, came back with the available records for the current group, younger animals, most of them under 8 months, and handed them across to her without the resistance he had shown in September. She read them at the counter, made her selections, and handed them back with 20 animals marked. He signed the transfer papers that afternoon with the efficiency of a man completing a routine transaction, because to him that was what it was. She had been taking heifers off his hands at fair prices for 2 years. The animals were below his replacement cutoff. The price was acceptable. The pen space was apparently available. There was nothing in the transaction from his position that required further examination. She drove home in the late afternoon light, with the signed papers in her coat pocket. The 20 new animals would arrive in 3 weeks. She had already drawn the new pen configuration in the back of the ledger, had already calculated the adjusted feed cost, had already added the purchase price to the expense total she was carrying. The number in the expense column was larger than she wanted to look at directly. She looked at it anyway. 60 head between the existing groups and the incoming 20. All of them Ashvale genetics. All of them selected from records she had requested and studied and used to make decisions no one at Ashvale had watched her making. The oldest group was bred and showing. The middle group was on schedule for breeding in the fall. The youngest group, the 20 coming in, would be the last she needed. The barn was noisier now than it had been a year ago, the more variable sound of young animals at different stages of development, each group carrying its own particular rhythm. She had learned to read those rhythms well enough that she noticed a change before she identified its source. She walked the length of the barn twice each evening, listening as much as looking, checking the water pails and the bedding and the condition of the boards without needing to make it a formal inspection. August brought the first calving. She had known it was coming, had the date marked on the calendar, had checked the first group twice daily through July, had told Doc Oakes in June what to expect and when. But the knowing and the fact of it were two different things. And when the first heifer in the original Ashvale group came into labor on a Thursday night, Etha was in the barn within 20 minutes of the first and second through the entire process, which ran longer than she had hoped, but cleanly, without complication. The calf hit the ground at 10 past midnight. She dried it with rough cloth, guided it to the mother, watched the first nursing with her back against the pen boards and the lamp held up in her left hand. She wrote the entry in the ledger at the kitchen table at midnight. Date, dams, tag number, Ashvale's number, calf condition, birth weight estimated by hand, time of first nursing. Then she looked at the dam's tag number for a moment before she wrote the next line. The animal that had walked off an Ashvale wagon as a rejected heifer calf below the creamery's replacement standard had just completed her first calving with a healthy calf and a clean birth record on a farm she had been brought to, because nobody at Ashvale had counted what she would become. Etha set the pen down. She did not write any further analysis of that. The ledger recorded facts, and the facts were sufficient. By the end of August, 4 more of the group had calved. 3 of those were clean and straightforward. 1 required Doc Oakes, who came out on short notice and handled it without drama. By September, Etha had the first 5 animals in post-calving condition, beginning their earliest lactation, producing milk she did not have a buyer for yet, but which she recorded daily regardless. She also had a problem she had been aware of since spring and had not yet solved. She could carry the operation through the fall. The bank extension held through the winter, but if Ashvale did not come to her by early spring of 1885, if they found another source, or if the barn completion fell behind schedule and they decided to wait, she would run out of capital before she had a buyer for the herd she had built. The timing she had calculated was precise. It left no margin for delay she had not caused and could not prevent. October arrived. The middle group went to breeding as scheduled. Doc Oakes confirmed the first 5 animals' health and production records and added his notes to the files she kept for each one. The youngest group, The 20 that had arrived in the spring was coming along well, ahead of her weight targets for their age. She sat at the kitchen table on a Friday evening in late November, with both ledgers, the bank extension paperwork, and the calendar. She worked through the numbers for the last time that month, confirmed that they were what they were, and closed everything back into its place on the shelf. The barn she was feeding was worth something. The question was whether the would arrive before she ran out of the means to keep feeding it. That was not a question she could answer from the kitchen table. She had done everything the plan required. The rest was timing, and timing was the one thing she had never fully controlled, only prepared for, only worked toward, only positioned herself to meet when it arrived. She turned down the lamp and went upstairs. Outside, the November dark pressed against the windows of the Voss farm, and inside the barn, 60 animals breathed and shifted in their pens, each one wearing a tag stamped with another operations mark, each one carrying 2 years of careful decisions in the condition of their coats, and the steadiness of their weight, and the clean entries in a ledger that sat on a shelf above a cold kitchen stove. December came in without wind, which was worse in its way than the storms. Still settled into the barn boards and the water pails, and the joints of the animals that had been standing in the same pens since August, and it did not give warning before it deepened. Etha added a third bedding layer to the youngest group's pen in the first week of December and checked the water twice daily because still cold froze pails faster than moving air. The oldest group, the original 13, now in active lactation, required the closest attention in cold weather, and she gave it to them without compromise, adjusting their weed upward when the temperature dropped and monitoring their udder condition with a particular vigilance that early lactation demands in hard winters. The expense ledger sat on the shelf above the stove. She had calculated the figures often enough that the numbers can become whether she carried in the back of her awareness present, specific, not something she could alter by looking at it more frequently. What remained in the account at First Bank of Caldwell's Ford would carry the operation through February without difficulty. March would require discipline. April depended on what happened before it. January arrived, and with it Doc Oaks. He came out on a Tuesday, the roads passable after a week of cold dry enough to keep the mud from forming. He brought his kit and a manner that had grown progressively less formal over the 2 years he had been visiting this farm. Not less professional, but the ease of a man who no longer needed to spend the first part of each visit establishing what kind of operation he was dealing with. He knew what kind of operation this was. He had watched it become what it was. He worked through the oldest group first, because they were in active lactation and warranted the closest attention. He moved through the pen methodically, checking production condition, udder health, the structural soundness he always assessed in the hind legs and the toplin. When he finished with the last animal, he stood in the center of the pen and looked at the group as a whole before he came to where Etha stood with the file binder open. The first 5 that calved their production records over the last 4 months. She turned to the pages and held them out to him. He read through them without rushing. These are cleaner than what I'm seeing from established herds in this county. He closed the binder, not the highest numbers, but the most consistent. Consistent was what I selected for. He handed the binder back. I know. I'm telling you it worked. She wrote his formal hustler clearance group in the certification column of each animal's file, and he signed them one by one at the pen gate while she held the binder. Then they moved to the middle group for the pregnancy checks. Of the 18 animals in the middle group, 16 confirmed in calf. 2 had not taken at first breeding. She had anticipated a figure in that range. The breeding records she had selected from had included dam line conception rate data, and she had weighted herself select toward lines with strong first cycle confirmation. 2 misses out of 18 was within what the records had predicted. She scheduled the 2 open animals for a second breeding attempt and noted the dates in their files. Doc Oaks lingered at the youngest group's pen longer than a standard assessment required. These were the animals he had seen arrive in the spring, thin and variable in development, as young stock often are when they come off a larger operations wagon at 8 months, and the difference between their condition then and their condition now required a pause. What are you planning to do with all of them? His voice was careful, the way it was when he was asking something he already had a theory about. Etha closed the gate latch. Sel looked at her. She had said it simply, as though it were obvious, which to her it was. But the word cell, applied to 60 carefully developed animals with documented breeding, confirmed pregnancy, and 2-year health records meant something specific, and he was working out exactly what it meant and to whom. Ashvale? Not a question. When they need them. He picked us back. He was quiet for the walk back through the barn, and she did not fill the silence because she had found over 2 years of his visits that his quiet usually meant he was thinking something through carefully rather than arriving at an objection. At the barn door, he stopped and turned back to look at the length of the building. 3 pens full of animals that had all walked in as somebody else's discards. They don't know what they have. He said it as though the thought had arrived fully formed while he was walking. No, Etha said, not yet. He left her with his signed certification pages and the particular expression he wore when a situation had confirmed something he had been watching develop for long enough that the confirmation carried its own quiet weight. February was the hardest month financially. The cold required more bedding, more feed, more of the kerosene she used in the equipment shed small heater to keep the pasteurizer lines from freezing. On the mornings, the temperature dropped below what the barn's passive warmth could manage. She tracked every expenditure with the same precision she applied to the animal records. Not because precision would change the figures, but because imprecision would hide where the problem was until it was larger than she could address. She was still receiving the rejected milk loads from Ashvale every Thursday. The arrangement had not been discussed since she signed the original agreement, and it had not needed to be. The wagons came. She sampled and pasteurized and distributed. The youngest group consumed what the older animals no longer needed, and the record of every batch sat in the shed log alongside the pasteurizer maintenance notes and the dual gauge reading she had never once skipped since the June incident in 1883. On a Thursday morning in early March, the Ashvale driver was a different man than usual. Theron, who had driven the rejected load route since the beginning of the arrangement, was out with a bad hand. The man who came in his place was named Willard, older, talkative in the way of someone who had spent years on roads with only a horse for company, and welcomed any variation in the routine. He helped with the valve while Etha took her sample, and he talked while he worked. He talked about Ashvale's new barn, which was further along than she had seen from the road. The framing was up on the west section. They had brought in a crew from 2 counties over to push the timeline. Hagen had been driving everyone hard, harder than usual, which for Hagen was already a high standard. The owner wanted the barn operational before winter. That meant they needed animals in it by October at the latest. Etha took her temperature reading. She wrote down the wagon number. Willard leaned against the tank while the last of the load drained. He said that Hagen had been sending letters and making inquiries about replacement heifers for the past 6 weeks. Springing animals, developed and documented. The kind that could go straight into a milking operation without a settling period. He had sent to farms in the next county and to a broker in the eastern part of the state and had not found what he was looking for at a price that made sense with the transport costs added. Etha capped her sample jar. Willard shook out the last of the line and began coiling it. He had heard, he said, that there was a farm on this road, the Heifers place. He thought he'd passed the lane that had a large group of heifers close to calving. Someone at the dairy had mentioned it. He wasn't sure who. Etha thanked him for the delivery. She asked him to tell the office that the load was acceptable and would be documented in the usual manner. He climbed back to his seat, lifted the reins, and turned the wagon down the lane toward the road. She waited until he was out of sight. Then she walked back into the barn, unlatched the gate to the oldest pen, and stood in the center of it for a moment with the sample jar in one hand and the temperature log in the other. The calculation had always depended on 2 things arriving at the same time. Her animals ready, Ashvale needing them. She had controlled the first with 2 years of a daily work. The second had been outside her reach, something she had positioned for without being able to determine when it would resolve. It appeared it was resolving now, in March, which gave her 4 weeks before the first of the oldest group reached the stage Ashvale's new barn required. She did not send a letter. She did not ask Willard to carry a message back. She went into the house, opened the production log, recorded the morning's batch details, and continued the day as she had continued every day for 2 years. The following week, Doc Oakes stopped in on a Wisconsin farm down the road to check on the 2 open animals from the middle group who were due for their second breeding assessment. He confirmed both had taken. She wrote the breeding dates in their files and handed him the certification pages to sign. He was capping his pen when he mentioned, with the practiced casualness he used for things he considered significant, that he had run into one of Ashvale's men at the feed merchant in Caldwell's Ford. He had heard they were struggling to source replacement animals. I know, Etha said. He looked at her. She was writing in the ledger. He waited to see if she would add anything. She did not. He left without pressing it. She heard his wagon go down the lane and turn the page in the ledger. The animals were ready. The buyer was looking. She was not going to move toward the buyer. She had been patient for 2 years, and she would remain patient for as long as the operation could sustain it, because any approach she made from a position of financial urgency would weaken what she intended to present from a position of complete preparation. She recalculated the expense account on a Sunday evening. She could hold the operation in full through April without compromising the animal care. May would require something to change. On a Thursday morning in the 3rd week of March, she was in the equipment shed running a pasture fire through the week's rejected load when she heard a wagon on the lane. Not Theron's wagon. The sound was different, lighter, a single horse rather than the heavy team Ashvale used for the milk runs. She finished the pasteurizer check before she went to the door. Court Hagen's wagon sat in the yard. He was already walking toward the barn when she came out of the equipment shed. He had not announced himself, which meant he had not been certain she would agree to see him, which told her something useful about where the balance of the situation now sat. He stopped when he saw her, and they stood in the yard with the early spring light coming low across the fields and the barn between them and the road. "I heard you might have some animals ready." His voice carried the same efficiency he brought to everything, but there was something under it. Not exactly urgency, more like the controlled tone of a man who has stopped pretending the urgency isn't there. "Come and look," Etha said. She led him into the barn without preamble. She opened the gate of the oldest pen, stepped back, and let him walk in alone. She moved through the animals with the eye of someone who had managed 1,800 cows for years and could read condition, structure, and development at a glance. He moved slowly, more slowly than she had expected, stopping at each animal with a kind of attention he had not paid to them 2 years ago when they walked off his own trailers as culls. He reached the first animal and bent down to read the ear tag. He straightened, he moved to the next one, read the tag, moved to the next. He worked through the entire pen without speaking. Etha stood at the gate and watched his face as he read number after number, each one stamped with the Ashvale mark, each one attached to an animal that had walked off an Ashvale wagon as a below-standard calf, and was now standing in front of him as a springing heifer in prime condition. When he reached the far end of the pen and turned back, his expression had changed in a way she recognized. Not shock, because a man like Hagen did not show shock, but the specific reconfiguration of a face that has just encountered information it did not have a category for. She had been ready for the question. She had been ready for it for 2 years. All of them? His voice was level, every tag. He came back to the gate, and she handed him the binder she had carried in from the house when she heard his wagon. It held 60 files, one for each animal, organized chronologically from the date of arrival, with the breeding records, weight logs, vaccination schedules, pregnancy confirmations, and health certificates in order behind each animal's tag number. Doc Oakes' signature appeared on every certification page. Hagen opened it at the first file. He read it with the thoroughness of a man who understood exactly what he was looking at and was taking his time to confirm that it was what it appeared to be. He turned pages without speaking. He went from the first file to the fifth, then jumped to one from the middle group, then to one of the youngest animals. Etha let him navigate it however he chose. The documentation held in every direction. She had made sure of that. He closed the binder. "When did you see the expansion permit?" He asked it without looking up. "November of 1883. She did not add anything to that. The timing was self-evident in the animal records. He could trace it himself if he needed to. He stood at the pen gate with the binder in his hands, looking back at the 60 animals. The oldest group was showing well in the morning light coming through through the south windows. Coats in the particular condition of showy but deeply sand, the kind of condition that holds through the stress of calving and early lactation without needing to be maintained by anything unusual. "You raised them on my own milk." He said it quietly, not with anger, more with the tone of a man completing an arithmetic problem he started working on the moment he read the first ear tag. "Your rejected milk," Etha said. "The loads you were paying to dispose of." He was quiet for a moment. Outside, one of the animals in the middle pen shifted against the boards. The morning light moved slightly as a thin cloud crossed the sun. "I need springing heifers by October." He set the binder on the gatepost. "I've been to 3 counties." "I know." He looked at her. She held his gaze without effort. She had nothing to manage in her expression because she was not performing anything. She had done the work, the documentation was complete, the animals were what he needed, and the price she intended to name was fair by the standards of what the market would have required him to pay for inferior animals delivered from a greater distance with inferior records. She told him to come to the house. She put the kettle on and set 2 cups on the table. He sat across from her with the binder between them and the morning light coming through the kitchen window, the same window she had sat at for 2 years of Sunday evenings, with the ledgers and the calendar and the figures that had always been pointing toward this particular morning. She slid a single page across the table. 60 springing heifers, $2,300 per head, $138,000 total, to be paid in 2 installments, half on signing, half on delivery. He read it. He read it again. "Market for animals without these records is lower." He said it as a negotiating position, not a conviction. "Market for animals without these records also doesn't include 2 years of individual health documentation, confirmed pregnancies, and a veterinary signature on every certification page." She poured the tea. "Market for animals without these records also can't deliver to your barn in April." He picked up the page and looked at it for a long time. "The transport from other operations," he said, "is expensive. and those animals would need 4 to 6 weeks of adjustment before they could go into a new milking environment. These animals know Wisconsin winters. They know the feed you use because they were raised on your milk. She set the pot down. You're not buying heifers. You're buying heifers that already belong to your operation in every way ex the paperwork. The kitchen was very quiet. A log in the stove settled. The kettle had stopped steaming. Hagen set the page flat on the table. He took out his pen. He looked at the total one more time. Not with resistance now, but with the expression of a man completing a transaction he has already decided on and is being thought information. He signed. Etha took the page back, added her own signature below his, and kept one copy for the file she would start for the sale. She gave him the other. He folded it once and put it in his coat. They drank the tea without conversation. He asked one question about the youngest group's projected readiness. They would not be springing until the following spring, and he wanted to know whether the arrangement could extend to cover them. She said it could. Under a separate agreement, she would prepare when the first delivery was complete. He nodded. He finished the tea. At the door he stopped, his hat in his hand. He looked out at the barn for a moment before he turned back. You could have approached me 6 months ago. Etha held the door. I could have. He waited for more. She did not offer it. After a moment, he put on his hat and walked to his wagon. She stood at the door until the sound of the wheels had faded down the lane and the yard was quiet again. The delivery date was set for the second week of April. She spent the intervening days in preparation, pulling each animal's complete file and checking it one final time perhaps, updating the most recent weights, making sure Doc Box had signed every certification that required his signature. She wrote a letter to Gunderson at First Bank of Caldwell's Ford requesting a meeting the week after the first delivery. Doc Oakes came out the day before the first wagons were due. He worked through the oldest group with a final health check, signed the last set of transport certificates, and stood at the pen gate with the papers stacked in his hand. You're going to have an empty barn tomorrow night. I know. She took the papers from him and checked each signature. He watched her check them. He had the look he wore when he was about to say something he'd been holding back for a while. I've been a veterinarian in this county for 30 years. I have not seen a single operator of any size do what you just did. Etha filed the last paper into the binder. I kept records. You kept records, he said carefully, in the service of a plan that required 2 years to execute without anyone understanding what you were doing. She closed the binder. You understood. He thought about that. I saw pieces of it. That was by design. She said it without apology. Not because the secrecy had been strategic, though it had been, but because the plan had not required anyone else's belief to proceed. It had required only her own certainty and the daily work of earning the outcome she had already calculated. He picked up his bag. The second group. The middle animals. Spring of next year. He nodded slowly. He walked to his wagon without looking back at the barn, which she understood to be his way of not making more of the moment than the moment required. She appreciated that about him. The next morning, 4 Ashvale wagons turned off the county road and came up the lane in a line. Etha was at the barn gate when they arrived. She had the binder, the certified files, and the loading list she had organized by pen so that the oldest animals went first, and the sequence was logical for the drivers. The lead driver, Theron, who had returned from his injury with his right hand wrapped but his left hand capable, looked at the line of wagons behind him, then at the barn, then at her. Big load, he said. 60 head. She opened the binder to the loading list. I'll check the ear tags as they go up the ramp. She stood at the loading chute for 2 hours. Each animal walked up the ramp in sequence, and Etha read the tag number aloud as it passed. A second driver at the top of the ramp confirmed against his own list. When all 60 were loaded and the wagons were secured, she handed Theron the transport documentation, one complete packet for each wagon sealed, addressed to Hagen's office. Theron looked at the packets. You prepared these ahead, yesterday. He tucked them under the seat board of the first wagon. He glanced back at the loaded animals, then at the barn with its gates standing open, and said nothing further, the response of a man who had delivered enough animals to farms to recognize a significant transaction when he was part of one. The wagons went down the lane in the same order they had arrived. Etha stood at the gate until they reached the road and turned. She listened to the sound of the wheels and the horses and the movement of 60 animals until it was replaced by the ordinary sounds of a county road in an April morning. A distant wagon, wind in the tree line north of the field, a crow somewhere along the creek. She went inside. The kitchen table was clear. She sat down without the ledger, without the binder, without the expense record or the calendar. She sat with her hands flat on the table in the quiet of an empty barn coming through the walls of the house for the first time in 2 years. Not the silence of a farm that had stopped. The silence of a farm that had finished something. She did not stay at the table long. She had a letter to write to the bank, a file to close, a new page to open in the ledger. She had a second agreement to draft for the middle group, which Hagen expected on his desk by the end of the month. She had a third group of animals in pens that needed feeding at noon. She pulled the ledger from the shelf above the stove and set it on the table. She opened it to the last page that held writing, the final entry in the record of the 60 animals she had raised, dated that morning, noting the delivery complete and the transport documentation transferred. She drew a single line below it, straight and even. She turned to the next page. It was blank. The whiteness of it was particular, not empty in the way the barn had been empty after Harlan's wagons left, which had been a whiteness of loss. This was the whiteness of something that had not yet been written, which was a different condition entirely. She picked up the pen. She wrote the date in the upper left corner. Below it she wrote, Lot 1, 1885 season, delivery complete. Second agreement ping. Middle group, 16 confirmed in calf. 2 confirmed breeding, October 1884. Calving projected August through September 1885. She set the pen down. Outside the kitchen window, the April light was moving across the north field, the kind of light that comes after a long winter, with enough warmth in it to mean something. The yard was quiet. The lane was empty. The barn held only the youngest animals now. 20 heifers growing steadily toward a calendar date she had already calculated, on a schedule she had already written down, toward a buyer who had already told her he would be back. In the equipment shed, the pasteurizer sat in its corner. The dual gauges were calibrated. The protocol was written on the board above the inlet valve. The Thursday wagon would come next week, and the week after, and the week after that. The first bank payment would clear before the end of the month. The mortgage at First Bank of Caldwell's Ford would follow in May, paid in full, ahead of any term Gunderson had offered her the grace to extend. She had not told him that yet. She intended to deliver that news in person with the same 2 pages of documentation she brought to every meeting, specific, organized, without flourish. She pulled the pen back toward her and added one final line to the new page. Thursday, reject load expected. Pasteurizer calibrated. Both gauges confirmed. Ashvale had seen a disposal bill disappear each week for 3 years. What they had never seen was the ledger that made sense of every Thursday morning, every rejected load, every brass-numbered ear tag that had walked off their trailers as something they no longer wanted. Etha Voss had looked at what other people called waste and understood, with the patience that comes from 19 years of reading what records actually say, that waste is usually just value that hasn't been counted yet. She closed the ledger, set it back on the shelf above the stove, and went out to feed what remained.